The blood on Naomi Preston's hands wasn't hers, and that made it worse. She knelt beside the mangled carcass of what had been a prize stallion 3 hours ago, her fingers tracing the distinctive claw marks that told a story most folks in Chloride, Arizona, wouldn't believe. The year was 1881, and this high desert town had seen its share of predators, but nothing like what had been hunting livestock for the past month. The tracks leading away from the scene were fresh, pressed deep into the red earth, and Naomi could read them like words on a page. She stood, wiping her hands on her leather riding pants, and surveyed the landscape. The September sun beat down mercilessly, turning the scrubland into a shimmering furnace. Most trackers would have given up by now, but Naomi wasn't most trackers. At 23, she'd spent 15 years learning the land from her father, a half Navajo scout who'd taught her that every creature left a signature in the wilderness. He'd died 2 years back, leaving her with a gift that had become her livelihood and her curse. Miss Preston. The voice behind her was rough as gravel, touched with an urgency that made her turn fast. The man approaching was tall, broad-shouldered, with dust coating his dark hair and exhaustion lining his face. Owen Lambert. She knew him by reputation even if they'd never properly met. He owned the largest ranch outside Chloride, ran cattle from here to the New Mexico border, and by the look of things, he was losing stock fast. Mr. Lambert. She acknowledged him with a nod, watching as he dismounted from a bay gelding that looked about as worn out as its rider. "I heard you were out here. Heard you're the best tracker in 3 territories." His eyes, she noticed, were an unusual shade of gray, like storm clouds over the mountains. They held hers with an intensity that made something flutter in her chest. She pushed the feeling aside. "I can follow sign if that's what you're asking. It's more than that." He moved closer and she caught the scent of leather and sage. "I've lost 12 head in 2 weeks. Whatever's doing this, it's smart. My men can't track it worth a damn." The thing disappears into terrain that should be impossible to cross without leaving marks. Naomi glanced back at the dead horse. Mountain lion. Big one. Male, probably 7 feet nose to tail, maybe 160 pounds. He's injured, though. See how the right forepad drags slightly. Something got him. He's desperate, hunting larger prey than he normally would because the smaller animals are too fast for him now. Owen Lambert stared at her, and she saw the exact moment he understood she wasn't guessing. "How can you possibly know all that?" "Same way you know when a horse is about to go lame before it shows obvious signs. You spend enough time watching, you learn to see." She walked to where the tracks began their journey away from the kill site. "He's heading northeast toward the canyon country. Rough terrain. He'll feel safer there." "I need you." The words came out fast, almost desperate. "I need you to track this animal and end this before I lose everything I've built. Name what you want, any price." Naomi turned to face him fully, studying the man who stood before her with his hat in his hands like a supplicant. There was pride in that face, worn thin by necessity. Owen Lambert wasn't a man who asked for help easily, which meant things were worse than he was letting on. $500. She said it without blinking. It was an enormous sum, more than most men made in a year. She expected him to balk, to argue, to turn and walk away. Done. His answer came without hesitation. "But I'm coming with you. Mr. Lambert, I work alone. Owen, and I didn't ask." He swung back into his saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on his feet. "That cat has killed animals I raised from foals, has terrorized my ranch hands to the point where half of them have quit. I'll follow your lead, stay out of your way, but I'm seeing this through." Naomi wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. She recognized grief when she saw it. Recognized the particular kind of pain that came from watching something you'd built with your own hands get torn apart piece by piece. She knew it because she'd felt it when her father died, when the world she'd known had crumbled and she'd had to forge a new path alone. Keep up then. She whistled sharp and clear, and her mare came trotting from where she'd been ground tied in the shade of a Joshua tree. The horse was a buckskin with intelligent eyes and the endurance of a camel. Naomi mounted in one smooth motion and pointed toward the distant canyon walls. "We've got maybe 6 hours of good light. That cat's moving fast, but he's hurt and tired. If we push, we might catch him before he finds a den to hole up in." They rode in silence for the first hour, following a trail that would have been invisible to most eyes. Naomi read the story in displaced stones, broken twigs, and the occasional partial print where the earth was soft enough to hold an impression. Owen stayed behind her, close enough that she could hear his horses breathing, far enough that he wasn't crowding her. She appreciated that. Most men she'd guided had a tendency to question every decision, to push ahead impatiently or suggest alternative routes. Owen Lambert simply trusted her skill and followed. The sun shifted westward, turning the sky the color of fire. The terrain grew rougher as they approached the canyon country. All red rock and twisted juniper, scattered barrel cactus and loose scree that made the horses pick their footing carefully. Naomi could feel the temperature dropping as they climbed, the desert's famous temperature swings already beginning. "You always do this alone." Owen's voice broke the silence and Naomi glanced back at him. "Tracking. Yes, most times anyway. Seems dangerous. What if something happens?" "What if you get hurt out here with nobody to help?" she shrugged, eyes still scanning the ground ahead. "Same could be said for ranching, or breaking horses, or any of a dozen things folks do out here to survive. Danger's just part of living. That's a lonely way to see the world." The observation stung more than she wanted to admit. "I see the world the way it is, Mr. Lambert. Pretty words don't change hard facts." "Owen," he corrected again, "and I wasn't criticizing, just observing. My wife used to say the same thing about me." The word wife sent an unexpected jolt through Naomi's chest. She told herself it was none of her business, that his personal life didn't matter. "Used to. She died 4 years back. Fever took her and our baby daughter both in the span of a week." His voice was matter of fact, but Naomi heard the old pain underneath. "After that, I threw myself into the ranch. Figured if I worked hard enough, I wouldn't have time to think about what I'd lost. Did it work? No. Simple, honest. But the ranch kept me alive when I didn't particularly want to be. Gave me purpose when everything else felt meaningless. So when I say I need to see this through, it's not just about the money or the livestock. It's about not letting one more thing I care about get destroyed." Naomi reined in her mare and dismounted near a cluster of boulders. The tracks led into a narrow defile between 2 rock faces, barely wide enough for a horse. "We go on foot from here. Stay close and stay quiet. If he's denned up in there, we don't want to spook him deeper into the rocks." Owen dismounted, pulling a Winchester rifle from his saddle scabbard. Naomi had her own rifle, a lever-action Henry that had been her father's. She checked the load, then moved forward with the careful silence of a hunting cat herself. The defile was dim and cool, the walls rising 20 feet on either side. The tracks were clearer here, pressed into sandy soil that held every detail. Fresh. Very fresh. She held up a hand and Owen froze behind her. Ahead, the defile opened into a small box canyon, and there, sprawled in the shade of an overhanging rock ledge, was the mountain lion. Even from 30 yards away, Naomi could see the infected wound on his right foreleg, the gaunt hollows in his flanks. He was sleeping, exhausted from his hunt and his pain. Owen raised his rifle, but Naomi put her hand on the barrel, pushing it down. He looked at her with confusion and frustration warring in his expression. She leaned close, her lips nearly brushing his ear as she whispered, "Look at him. Really look. He's dying already. That infection has spread. He's got maybe days left." "So we put him out of his misery and end the threat," Owen whispered back, his breath warm against her cheek. "Or we let nature take its course. He won't be hunting anymore. He's too weak. He came here to die." "And what about the next rancher who loses stock? What about the risk?" Naomi pulled back enough to meet his eyes. They were close, closer than she'd been to any man in longer than she could remember. "There's always risk. But that animal is doing what animals do, trying to survive. We don't have to kill everything that scares us." Something shifted in Owen's expression, a softening around his eyes. "You really believe that?" "I believe that death comes for all of us soon enough. We don't need to rush it." She stepped back, breaking the strange intimacy of the moment. "But it's your money, your choice. You hired me to track him." "I did. What happens next is on you." Owen lowered his rifle completely, letting it hang loose in his hands. He stared at the sleeping lion for a long moment, and Naomi watched emotions play across his face like clouds across the sun. Finally, he nodded. "We leave him. You're right. He's no threat anymore." They backed away slowly, carefully, leaving the dying predator to his fate. It wasn't until they'd reached the horses and mounted that Owen spoke again. "Why do I feel like you weren't just talking about the cat?" Naomi urged her mare forward, starting the journey back toward Chloride. "Maybe because you're smarter than you look." She heard him laugh, a surprised bark of sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Did you just insult me and compliment me in the same sentence?" Seemed efficient. But she was smiling despite herself, and when she glanced back, she saw he was smiling too. The ride back took longer, darkness falling fast in the desert once the sun dropped below the horizon. They made camp in a sheltered spot where an ancient cottonwood marked the presence of a seasonal spring. The water was low but sufficient, and Naomi set about building a small fire while Owen tended the horses. "You're good with them," she observed, watching him work. He had gentle hands, patient movements that the animals responded to with trust. "Horses make sense to me. Always have. People are harder." He finished picketing the animals where they could graze on the sparse grass and joined her by the fire. "You carry coffee in those saddlebags. What kind of tracker would I be if I didn't?" She pulled out a small pot and the makings of camp coffee, strong enough to strip paint. While it brewed, they sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them and the vast Arizona night spreading overhead like a jeweled blanket. "Can I ask you something?" Owen's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. Why tracking? Why spend your life following animals through wilderness when you could do anything else?" Naomi poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed him one, and considered her answer. The truth felt too raw, too revealing, but something about this man made her want to be honest. "My mother was white, died giving birth to me. My father was half Navajo, which meant I belonged nowhere. Too white for the reservation, too native for white society. But out here in the wilderness, none of that mattered. Animals don't care about blood. The land doesn't care about heritage. I could be good at this, be respected for this, without anyone questioning whether I had the right." Owen was quiet for a long moment, his coffee steaming in the cool night air. "For what it's worth, I think anyone who questions your right to do anything is a fool." The simple statement, delivered without flourish or drama, hit harder than any elaborate compliment could have. Naomi felt heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "That's a dangerous opinion in some circles. Then maybe I've been spending time in the wrong circles." He took a sip of coffee, winced at the strength of it, and took another sip anyway. "This is terrible, by the way. You're welcome." They both laughed, and the sound felt good, natural, like something that had been missing from Naomi's life without her realizing it. They talked through the night, trading stories of the desert, of the animals they'd known, of the strange and beautiful brutality of life in the territories. Owen told her about building his ranch from nothing, about the first cattle drive he'd led, and the flood that had nearly wiped him out in his second year. Naomi told him about tracking a wounded bear for 3 days through a blizzard in the White Mountains, about finding a lost child when everyone else had given up hope. The more they talked, the more Naomi realized how lonely she'd been. She'd convinced herself that solitude was strength, that not needing anyone made her invulnerable. But sitting across a campfire from Owen Lambert, watching the way firelight painted shadows across his angular face, she understood she'd been lying to herself. Strength wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing who to trust with your vulnerability. They rode into Chloride just after noon the next day, both tired and dusty, but somehow reluctant to part ways. Owen dismounted outside the Chloride Bank and Trust, disappearing inside for a few minutes before emerging with a leather pouch that he handed to Naomi without ceremony. 500, as agreed. She weighed the pouch in her hand, feeling the solid reality of more money than she'd ever held at once. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like an ending, and she discovered she didn't want this to end. "The cat will be dead within a week. Your stock should be safe." "Thanks to you." Owen stood there in the dusty street, his hat pushed back on his head, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Naomi, I know this was business, but I'd like to see you again. Not for tracking, just for seeing you." Her heart did something complicated in her chest. "Why?" "Because talking to you was the first time in 4 years I've felt like myself again. Because you're brilliant and brave, and you see the world in ways I never thought to look. Because when you smile, which you don't do often enough, the whole desert seems brighter." He took a step closer. "And because I think maybe you felt it too, this thing between us. Tell me I'm wrong and I'll leave you be, but if I'm right, then don't run from it just because it's unexpected." Naomi wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to take the money, ride away, go back to her solitary life where emotions couldn't hurt her. But she'd spent enough years running. She'd tracked dangerous animals through impossible terrain, survived things that would have broken lesser people. Surely she was brave enough to risk this. "You're not wrong." The admission felt like jumping off a cliff. "But Owen, I don't know how to do this. I've never let anyone close. I don't know if I can be what you need." "I don't need you to be anything except yourself." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and his fingers wrapped around hers with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "And I'm not asking for forever right now. I'm just asking for a chance. Dinner tomorrow. A real one, not trail rations and campfire coffee." "Your coffee isn't any better than mine," she pointed out, but she was squeezing his hand back, and she knew her answer was yes before she said it. "Tomorrow, but I'm not wearing a dress. I wouldn't expect you to." His smile was slow and genuine, reaching all the way to those storm-gray eyes. 7 o'clock, I'll pick you up. I'll meet you. I know where your ranch is." She wasn't ready to reveal where she lived, not yet. Some defenses took longer to lower than others. Fair enough. He released her hand reluctantly and stepped back. "Tomorrow, then." Naomi watched him ride away, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She'd tracked mountain lions and bears, had stared down wolves and rattlesnakes without flinching. But this terrified her more than any predator ever had, because this could actually hurt in ways a physical wound never could. She rode to the small cabin she rented on the outskirts of town, put away her gear, and counted the money Owen had paid her. $500. Enough to buy a piece of land, maybe start something of her own. Enough to leave Chloride and start fresh somewhere no one knew her story. Instead, she found herself imagining what tomorrow night might bring. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Naomi tried to work, cleaning her guns and mending tack, but her mind kept wandering. She found herself in front of her small mirror more than once, critically examining her sun-browned face, her dark hair that she usually kept braided tight. Finally, feeling foolish and defiant all at once, she let her hair down. It fell past her shoulders in waves she'd forgotten existed. She rode out to the Lambert ranch as the sun was beginning its descent, turning the sky shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too vivid to be real. The ranch was impressive, a sprawling operation with well-maintained buildings and extensive corrals. Owen met her at the main house, and she saw his eyes widen slightly when he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "I look the same as always, just cleaner." But she felt heat in her cheeks again. "Then I stand by my statement." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. He led her not into the house but around back, where a table had been set up on a covered porch overlooking the valley. Lanterns hung from the beams, not yet lit in the lingering daylight. The table held actual dishes, not tin plates, and the smell of cooking meat drifted from inside. "You did all this?" Naomi asked, surprised. "I can cook when I need to. Living alone teaches you a lot of skills." He pulled out a chair for her and she sat, feeling strangely formal and out of place. "I know you're used to being self-sufficient, so I hope this doesn't feel like I'm trying to prove something. I just wanted tonight to be nice." "It's nice," she admitted. "It's just different. I'm not used to anyone making an effort for me. Then people have been fools." He disappeared inside and returned with plates of steak, beans, and fresh bread that actually looked edible. They ate as the sun set and the stars emerged, talking about everything and nothing. Owen asked about her travels, and she found herself telling stories she'd never shared with anyone. He talked about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to breed horses as well as cattle, about the time he'd spent in Texas before coming to Arizona. "Why here?" Naomi asked. "Why Chloride?" "Because it felt like a place where I could build something that mattered. Because the land here is hard but honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." He paused, his eyes on hers across the table. "And now because it's where I met you." "We only met yesterday," she pointed out, but her pulse was racing. "Sometimes that's all it takes, to know that something matters." He stood and offered his hand. "Dance with me. There's no music, so we'll imagine some." It was absurd and impractical and completely unnecessary, and Naomi took his hand anyway. He pulled her close, one hand at her waist and the other holding hers, and they swayed together in the lantern light. She'd never danced before, not like this, but Owen led with patient confidence and she found herself following, her body learning a rhythm she'd never known existed. "This is crazy," she murmured, her head against his shoulder. "Probably." His voice was low, rumbling in his chest where her ear rested. "Do you want to stop?" "No." The truth of it surprised her. She didn't want to stop. She wanted to stay right here in this moment with this man who somehow made her feel brave and terrified all at once. They danced until full dark, until the desert cold made her shiver and Owen insisted on giving her his jacket. They talked until the lanterns burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, and when he finally walked her to her horse, he stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Can I kiss you?" He asked, and the fact that he asked, that he gave her the choice, made her decision easy. "Yes." His lips were soft against hers, tentative at first, then more certain as she responded. The kiss was everything and nothing like she'd imagined, sweet and intense, and filled with a promise that made her heart ache with possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me you'll come back," he whispered. "I'll come back." And she did. The next day and the next and the day after that. Gradually, without either of them quite planning it, her visits to Owen's ranch became routine. She'd arrive in the morning and ride out with him to check fence lines or move cattle. She'd share her knowledge of the land and its creatures, pointing out signs he'd never learned to read. He'd share his dreams and fears, his stories and hopes, until she felt like she knew him from the inside out. 3 weeks after that first dinner, Owen asked her to move into the ranch. Naomi's first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from the vulnerability of depending on someone else. But then she looked around her cramped cabin at the lonely life she'd built and realized she didn't want it anymore. She wanted what Owen was offering: partnership, companionship, love. "On one condition," she said. "I keep tracking. I don't give up who I am. I would never ask you to." Owen pulled her close, his arms solid and warm around her. "I love who you are, every part of you, the tracker, the loner, the woman who shows mercy to dying predators, all of it." So she moved in, bringing her few possessions and her buckskin mare. The ranch hands were skeptical at first, this Indian woman sharing the boss's house, but Naomi won them over with her skill and her willingness to work as hard as any of them. She tracked down missing cattle, found water sources during a dry spell, and once saved a young cowhand from a rattlesnake he'd almost stepped on. 6 months after they met, Owen proposed properly, with a ring he'd had made in Prescott. It was simple, a silver band with a small turquoise stone, and Naomi loved it more than any fancy diamond. "Marry me," he said, kneeling in the dust of the corral where she'd been working with a green horse. "Not because I need you, though I do. Not because you're useful, though you are. Marry me because I love you with everything I am, and I want to spend whatever time we have on this earth as your husband." "Yes." The answer came without hesitation, without fear. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed a month later in a small ceremony in Chloride, with the ranch hands as witnesses and a traveling preacher officiating. Naomi wore a dress after all, a simple blue one that Owen said matched the Arizona sky. His eyes had been bright with tears when he saw her, and her own had spilled over when he'd slipped the ring on her finger. The first year of their marriage was hard work and harder learning. Learning to live with someone, to navigate disagreements and compromises, to be vulnerable and trust that vulnerability wouldn't be used as a weapon. But they learned together, and every day Naomi felt more certain that she'd made the right choice. The ranch prospered. With Naomi's knowledge of the land and Owen's business sense, they expanded carefully, buying more stock and improving their water systems. Naomi still tracked when needed, her reputation spreading until people came from as far as New Mexico and California seeking her skills. Owen never complained about her absences, never tried to make her smaller or less than what she was. 2 years after their wedding, Naomi realized she was pregnant. The news terrified her. Her own mother had died giving birth, and the possibility that history might repeat felt like a curse hanging over her. But Owen held her through her fear, promised her they'd face whatever came together, and hired the best doctor in Prescott to attend the birth. Their son arrived on a cold January morning in 1884, howling his displeasure at the world with lungs that suggested he'd be every bit as stubborn as his parents. They named him Jacob after Owen's father, and Naomi fell in love all over again watching her rough cowboy husband cradle their tiny son with infinite gentleness. "He's perfect," Owen whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You're perfect, thank you." Motherhood was another challenge Naomi met head-on. She learned to balance tracking work with caring for Jacob, often taking him with her in a cradle board adapted from Navajo designs. The baby seemed to love the outdoors as much as his mother, rarely fussing even during long rides through rough terrain. When Jacob was 2, Naomi found herself pregnant again. This time the fear was less, replaced by excited anticipation. Their daughter, Rose, was born in the spring of 1886, arriving so fast that Owen barely had time to fetch the doctor. She was quieter than Jacob had been, observing the world with serious dark eyes that reminded Owen of Naomi. The ranch continued to thrive. Owen's horse breeding program attracted attention, and buyers came from back east to purchase his well-trained stock. Naomi expanded her tracking work to include teaching, running workshops for scouts and ranchers who wanted to improve their wilderness skills. Together, they built something that was theirs, something that honored both of their strengths. On their 5th anniversary, they sat on the porch where they'd had their first real dinner, watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Jacob and Rose were asleep inside, worn out from a day of helping with the horses. Owen held Naomi's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up the solitary life you had?" Naomi thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, alone, and convinced that was how she had to be. She thought about everything she'd gained since then, the love and family and partnership she'd never imagined possible. "Not for a single second," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "You gave me something better than solitude. You gave me belonging. You gave me life again," Owen replied, pulling her close. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of me was gone forever, but you brought me back. Made me remember how to hope, how to dream, how to love." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one until the sky was filled with light. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and Naomi smiled at the sound. The wilderness was still there, still wild and free, but now she had someone to share it with. Jacob grew into a lanky boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's gift for reading the land. Rose proved to be fearless, climbing everything in sight and demanding to help with every aspect of ranch work. When Jacob was 8 and Rose 6, Naomi gave birth to another son, Thomas, who arrived with a head of black hair and a temperament as sunny as an Arizona summer day. The years passed in the way years do, full of small joys and occasional sorrows. They lost horses to disease and cattle to drought. Owen's hands grew more calloused and his hair started showing silver. Naomi's face gained lines around her eyes from squinting at distant horizons. But through it all, they held on to each other and the life they'd built together. When Jacob turned 18, he announced his intention to study veterinary medicine back east. Owen had been surprised, but Naomi had seen it coming. Their son had inherited her patience with animals and Owen's desire to help. He'd be good at it. "You're not disappointed?" Jacob had asked his father anxiously. "That I'm not taking over the ranch, disappointed. I'm proud as hell." Owen had clapped his son on the shoulder. "You're following your own path. That takes courage. The ranch will be here when you're ready, if you're ever ready, and if not, we'll figure something else out." Rose had no interest in leaving. She took to ranch work like she'd been born for it, managing the hands with a combination of her father's fairness and her mother's no-nonsense practicality. By the time she was 20, she was essentially running the day-to-day operations, freeing Owen and Naomi to focus on the breeding program and Naomi's tracking work. Thomas, the youngest, was the family's surprise. Where Jacob was studious and Rose was practical, Thomas was artistic. He sketched everything, filling journal after journal with drawings of horses and cattle and desert landscapes. He followed Naomi on tracking expeditions not to learn the skill, but to capture the beauty of what they saw. Owen worried at first about having an artist in a ranching family, but Naomi reminded him that everyone had their own gifts. You wanted them to be themselves, she pointed out. That means accepting who they are, not who we imagined they'd be. Thomas eventually found his calling illustrating for scientific journals. His detailed drawings of flora and fauna, earning him commissions from universities and museums. He traveled extensively but always came home to the ranch, to the family that had nurtured his talents even when they didn't fully understand them. On their 20th anniversary, Owen arranged a surprise for Naomi. He'd been planning it for months, working with Jacob, who was now a successful veterinarian in Denver, with Rose, who managed the ranch, and with Thomas, who designed the key element. He led her out before dawn, both of them on horseback, riding toward the canyon country where they'd tracked that mountain lion so many years ago. Naomi went willingly, curious but not suspicious. They rode for 2 hours until the sun was fully up and the heat was building. Then Owen stopped at a spot that overlooked miles of pristine desert wilderness, and there, on a large flat rock, was a bronze plaque. Thomas had designed it, incorporating images of animals and plants native to the region. The inscription read, "The Naomi Preston Lambert Wildlife Preserve. Established 1901. Let the wild things lie free." Naomi stared at it, not understanding at first. Then Owen explained, "I bought this land, 10,000 acres of it, and I'm donating it to be preserved forever. No hunting, no ranching, no development, just wilderness the way you love it. The way you taught me to love it." Tears streamed down Naomi's face as the magnitude of the gesture hit her. 20 years ago, she'd spared a dying mountain lion because she believed in letting nature take its course. Now her husband had preserved an entire ecosystem in her name, ensuring that future generations would have wilderness to treasure. "Owen, this is too much. The cost alone is worth it." He dismounted and helped her down, holding her close. "You gave me everything, Naomi. A life worth living, children who make me proud every single day, a partnership that's made me better than I ever could have been alone. This is just me trying to say thank you in a language you'll understand." She kissed him there in the wild desert, surrounded by the land she loved and the man who loved her. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you anyway. They spent the day hiking through the preserve, Naomi pointing out tracks and signs, Owen listening with the same attentive interest he'd shown on their first tracking trip together. They found a mountain lion print, much smaller than the one from 20 years ago, and Naomi smiled. His descendants maybe, or just another cat living wild and free. Thanks to you, they'll have a place to do that for a long time. That evening they rode back to the ranch where their children had organized a celebration. Friends and neighbors from all over the territory had come to honor them, to celebrate not just their anniversary but their contributions to the community. Naomi, who'd once believed she belonged nowhere, stood surrounded by people who valued her, loved her, respected her. Late that night, after everyone had left and the children had finally gone to bed, Naomi and Owen returned to their porch. It had become their ritual over the years, this quiet time together watching the stars. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Naomi asked. "When you found me by that dead horse, I said I needed you. I told you to name your price. You did, and I asked for $500. She laughed softly. "I had no idea what I was really getting into. Would you have done it if you'd known it would lead to all this?" Naomi considered the question seriously. She thought about the fears she'd had, the walls she'd built around her heart. She thought about the courage it had taken to let those walls down, to trust Owen with her vulnerable places. She thought about the life they'd built together, full of love and challenge and growth. "Yes," she said finally. "Maybe I would have been more scared, maybe I would have hesitated longer, but yes, I would have done it, because you were worth the risk. We were worth the risk." Owen pulled her close, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned each other's languages over 20 years. The desert night wrapped around them, cool and vast and full of stars. Somewhere out in the preserve, a coyote sang. Another answered. The wild was alive and thriving, and so were they. "I love you," Owen murmured against her hair. "I love you too." Naomi closed her eyes, content in a way she'd never imagined possible. Always. The years continued to unfold in their gentle, inevitable way. Jacob married a teacher from Denver and brought her back to Arizona to meet the family. She was smart and kind, and she loved Jacob with a fierceness that reminded Naomi of her own love for Owen. Rose fell for one of the ranch hands, a quiet man named Samuel who treated her like the treasure she was. Thomas never married, finding fulfillment in his art and his travels, but he always maintained that the love he saw between his parents had set an impossible standard. Owen and Naomi grew old together, their hair turning silver, their bodies acquiring the aches and pains of lives fully lived. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with each passing year, becoming something richer and more complex than the passionate beginning had suggested possible. On a spring morning in 1911, Naomi woke to find Owen unusually quiet. He'd been having trouble with his heart for the past year, the doctor warning them both that time was precious. She'd been trying not to think about it, trying to live each day as fully as possible. But looking at him now, she saw something in his face that made her chest tighten. "Owen." "I'm here, love." He reached for her hand, his grip still strong despite his failing body. "I'm here. I just wanted to look at you, to memorize this, us. Don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere, Naomi." His voice was gentle, the same tone he'd used to calm spooked horses. "We both know that's not true, but it's all right. I've had 30 years with you. 30 years of love and life and more happiness than any man deserves. I'm not afraid." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Well, I am. I don't know how to do this without you." "Yes, you do. You're the strongest person I've ever known." He brushed away her tears with a tenderness that broke her heart. "You survived before me. You'll survive after, but you won't be alone. You'll have the children, the grandchildren, the life we built together. That doesn't end just because I do." He lasted another 3 days, surrounded by family, drifting in and out of consciousness. When the end came, it was peaceful. He opened his eyes one last time, found Naomi's face, and smiled. "Best decision I ever made," he whispered, "asking you to track that cat. Best decision I ever made was saying yes." She held his hand as his breathing slowed and then stopped, as the man she'd loved for 3 decades slipped away into whatever came next. The grief was enormous, a physical weight that made breathing difficult. But Naomi had meant what she'd told Owen all those years ago about death coming for everyone. She'd known this day would arrive eventually. That didn't make it hurt less, but it did give her a framework for handling the pain. She buried him on the ranch, in a spot overlooking the valley he'd loved. The whole community turned out for the funeral, testament to the man he'd been and the life he'd lived. Naomi stood straight and dry-eyed through the service, accepting condolences with grace. But that night, alone in the bed they'd shared for 30 years, she finally let herself break down and weep. Healing took time, but it came. The children surrounded her with love and support. Rose and Samuel moved into the main house to keep her company. Jacob visited as often as his practice allowed, bringing his wife and their children. Thomas stayed for 6 months, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with drawings of his father, trying to capture the essence of the man in charcoal and ink. Naomi continued to track, finding solace in the wilderness that had always been her refuge. But now when she found animal signs, she talked to Owen as if he were riding beside her, sharing observations the way they had for 3 decades. Sometimes she swore she could hear his voice answering, feel his presence in the warm desert wind. Years passed. Naomi's body grew frail, but her mind stayed sharp. She taught her grandchildren to track, passing on the skills her father had given her. She told them stories of their grandfather, of the cowboy who'd said he needed her, and had proven every day for 30 years that he'd meant it. On a bright morning in 1916, 5 years after Owen's death, 70-year-old Naomi Preston Lambert rode out into the desert one final time. Rose tried to stop her, worried about her mother's failing health, but Naomi insisted. "I'm going to the preserve," she said simply. "I'll be back by sunset." But she knew she was lying. She could feel it in her bones, the way animals could sense coming storms. Her time was near, and she wanted to spend it in the place that meant the most to her. She rode to the overlook where Owen had surprised her with the preserve. The bronze plaque was weathered now, but still legible. She sat on the warm rock and looked out over miles of pristine wilderness, teeming with life. Somewhere out there, mountain lions still hunted. Coyotes still sang. The wild endured. Naomi closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face. She thought about her father teaching her to track, about the lonely years before Owen, about that fateful day when a desperate cowboy had found her beside a dead horse and changed her life forever. She thought about 30 years of love, of partnership, of building something beautiful in harsh terrain. She thought about her children and grandchildren, the legacy she and Owen had created together. "I'm coming, Owen," she whispered to the desert wind. "I tracked you down once. I can do it again." Her heart, worn out from 70 years of beating, simply stopped. When Rose and Samuel found her that evening, she was still sitting upright, a peaceful smile on her face, looking out over the land she'd loved and protected. They buried her beside Owen, their graves marked with simple stones that bore only their names and years. But their true memorial was everywhere, in the preserve that bore Naomi's name, in the ranch that their children and grandchildren continued to run, in the stories that would be told for generations about the tracker and the cowboy who'd found each other in the wild Arizona desert and built a love strong enough to weather anything. Years later, when Rose's grandchildren asked about their great-grandparents, she'd take them to that overlook. She'd show them the bronze plaque and tell them the story of how a dying mountain lion had brought 2 people together, how a cowboy's desperate need and a tracker's mercy had sparked something neither expected, how love could flourish even in the harshest terrain if 2 people were brave enough to tend it. And standing there in the wilderness that Naomi and Owen had protected, surrounded by the wild beauty they'd fought to preserve, those children would understand that some love stories don't end with death. They continue, echoing through generations, inspiring others to be brave enough to take the risk, to open their hearts, to build something lasting in the face of an uncertain world. The wild endured. Love endured. And the legacy of Naomi Preston Lambert and Owen Lambert lived on in every creature that hunted freely through the preserve, in every child who learned to read tracks in the dust, in every person who chose courage over fear and love over loneliness. The desert remembered them. The land remembered. And that was enough.